One day, everyone will have always been against this. That's the title of a new book that is a searing critique of the West's complicity with Israel's genocide in Gaza. So how will history actually remember this period? This week on UpFront, I'll be asking that question to author and journalist Omar El Akkad. Omar Al Akkad, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You have lived in the West since you were 16 years old. You've also reported extensively on the so-called war on terror, the U.S. war in Afghanistan, Iraq, the military tribunals in Guantanamo. But as you have been watching the coverage and the live streams of Israel's genocide in Gaza, have your views on the West changed?
I think the short answer is yes. I think what has actually changed in a more profound manner is my relationship to my own cowardice, I suppose. And what I mean by that is I began my journalism career right around the time of the start of the war on terror. I started the student newspaper a few days after 9/11, and basically the only real job I've ever had was as a journalist. It was during those years. But because since the age of 5, basically, I've been attuned to the West. It's the reason I sound the way I do. It's the reason I'm familiar with this culture and am fluent in it. When you go to a place like Afghanistan, you're covering the war on terror, and you're at a forward operating base, and you see that almost without exception, the troops that are stationed out front, who are most likely to get killed, are the Afghanistani troops. And you understand that there's a hierarchy of life. You start to see things that should cause you to question your view of this entire endeavor. But what I was very, very good at for the majority of my adult life was to be able to compartmentalize these things and say, well, this is a special exception. This is just happening in this situation. You go to Guantanamo Bay, you watch an entire legal system be created from scratch. And it's created purely to derive convictions. Hearsay evidence is allowed. People are being kept in makeshift dog kennels, essentially. And you're able to compartmentalize. You're able to say, well, just in this location, just in this moment, just under these circumstances.
So to be clear, you still had a critique of it. You just didn't connect it to a broader system.
I think so, because I needed to believe that the bedrock was able to hold everything up. And I think over the last year and a half in particular, that ability has failed me. I can no longer do that. I've seen too much of an ongoing atrocity that my tax dollars are paying for. And that has essentially rendered my previous defense mechanisms against this unusable.
The title of your newest book, which I love, by the way, both the book and the title, is One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This. It's such an evocative title. What did you mean by it, though?
I mean, look, I'm not a particularly smart person. I think in terms of pattern recognition a lot of the time. And so I was thinking in terms of how it's very difficult to find a modern liberal who will tell you that they were always in favor of segregation or in favor of apartheid in South Africa. There was a certain amount of time that passed, and then this became not only the socially acceptable position to hold, but also within the context of liberalism, a position that you couldn't not hold, right, within polite society. Whereas you start going back, and the opposite becomes true. And I was thinking of this in terms of what I think is going to happen in the now almost century-long, 3/4 of a century-long occupation of the Palestinians and their land, and how one day it's going to be safe. And once it's safe, a switch will flip. Because if you live in this part of the world and you don't have a personal connection, I suppose, there is always the option to just look away and adopt whatever the socially acceptable position is. And I just think that's going to change in the same way that it has changed with respect to every historical injustice that I can think of.
Israel's war on Gaza, as they call it, has been called the most documented genocide in history. You've talked about the function of your work being a witness to what's happening. And right now, at this moment, we're all witnesses. People are writing about it, they're discussing it, they're sharing videos. I mean, there's no way to kind of avoid what's happening. And yet still, the assault carries on. Does bearing witness no longer mean what it used to? Should I be thinking about this differently?
I mean, I think in the book I describe it as the most necessary and pathetic function of literature, is to bear witness, because that's effectively what you do. I mean, this book, it's possible you read it and you despise it, or you hate every argument in it, or you don't agree with it, but necessarily it's going to outlive me, even if it's just collecting dust on a library shelf somewhere. And you have to think in that kind of time frame, right? And so to be able to put these words down and to say, here is what I saw, and here's how it affected me, means something. But it doesn't change the fact that I wake up every morning and I turn on my computer and I see documented evidence of the worst things human beings can do to one another. And so there's a constant kind of undercurrent of dejection. I wrote a book, who the hell cares? Well, it's the only thing I know how to do. And so you have to balance these things, but to be perfectly honest with you, I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
That's a rare response I get from someone who writes as an expert, but it's an important one to say, hey, there's some uncertainty here that we have to work through and sit through, but that requires engagement. There's a line in the book where you say that some people have the privilege of not engaging, of just looking away. And as we can see, many choose to do just that. What do you say to those people?
I mean, I think in the book there's this, I talk about this conversation I have with a person who says something like, I'm not a Zionist, but I'm also not an anti-Zionist. It's all very complicated. And I don't know how to respond to that, right? Because I feel like I'm watching someone audition various opinions that they could hold, working backwards from the intended consequence, which is as little social friction as possible. And to be honest, I've done this numerous times in many, many contexts. Where,
like what? I can't imagine you doing that. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, there's lots of situations. I mean, I'm at my kids' school volunteering, and there's a couple of grandparents who hear that I have. We were talking about Portland State, where there had been some student protesters against the genocide in Palestine, and immediately the position one of these people takes is, "This is so rude. These students need to know their place." And there's a part of me that immediately wants to say, look, I just came from a part of the world where protest is met with, and this seems ironic now in the context of the United States, but you get snatched into a van and no one hears from you again, right? And so, like, the most important thing for me happening at that university right now is that these students protest. And instead of saying any of that, in my head I think, man, you're at a fun run. Just keep it quiet, just move. And the number of times I have succumbed to that kind of cowardice is more numerous than I can count. So I often say there's nothing that this book indicts or autopsies or interrogates that I'm not directly complicit in. It's very easy for me to throw these stones around, but I live in that house.
Are we being too hard on ourselves, though? Sometimes it doesn't feel like it's a position of cowardice as much as it is the world is influencing our takes and our perspectives. We're told that that's an isolated case, and we're told that it's more complicated or more nuanced than we understand. Is there a way that, we should be more accountable, but maybe it's not always a moral failure as much as it is an information failure?
I don't know. And I think one of the difficulties for me in answering that question with any kind of certainty is that relative to the experiences that I'm seeing right now, who cares for me personally, right? Like, we're having this conversation, and I'm having it with someone whose work I deeply, deeply respect on this issue. And we are having it on the launching side of the missiles, right? I am talking to you simultaneously knowing that I'm killing those kids. I'm doing that. My tax money is doing that. And we can have a conversation about whether I should stop paying taxes, and that should be my form of resistance, or any number of avenues of resistance, but it's still in the context of a level of privilege that, relative to the atrocity that I'm seeing every single day, makes it very difficult for me to sort of center my wrongdoing or how absent of hypocrisy I might be, or vice versa. All of this is hypocrisy, right? The minute you stand up to any of this, you have to remind yourself that you are within that system that is creating this. And so that makes it a difficult question to answer. But even if I had a good answer, I think the focus would be not so much on where I stand as on what this is and whatever we can do to stop it.
Now, let's talk about journalism for a minute. As a journalist, you've covered a lot of stories: the Iraq War, the Afghanistan war, Guantanamo. What role has the media played here at this moment? How has the coverage of Gaza actually affected what's happening on the ground?
I think simultaneously it's been an incredibly camouflaging endeavor in terms of whether actively or passively building consent for what is happening right now, especially in the early days of this. But then it's also been incredibly clarifying. I think it's very, very difficult to watch most of mainstream Western journalism over the last year and a half and not know exactly where you stand, not know exactly where institutionally the media orientation is. And what I mean by that is, of course, the very simple comparison between what happens when a hospital is bombed over there versus when a hospital is bombed over here, sort of thing, right? You know that the arsenal of language is there. You know that the language to describe atrocity is available to these broadcasters, to these op-ed columnists, to everyone. And you know when it's deliberately withheld and an entirely different tool set is brought out. There's a part in the book where I talk about this British TV newscaster who's describing a Palestinian girl who was shot by Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint, and the language is something like, a bullet found its way into the van and hit a 4-year-old young lady.
The mysterious passive language.
The mysterious 4-year-old young lady. What is that, right?
Yeah.
Like just as a construction. And so as much as it's been infuriating, it's also been deeply, deeply clarifying, because there are certain avenues of uncertainty that I had with regards to this medium and this process and this endeavor that I don't have anymore. I know now because I've seen it in a way that, again, my previous cowardice of being able to compartmentalize can't compartmentalize.
What are one of those questions that were clarified for you in the context of this?
The chief one, and the one I return to over and over again, is that there exists in certain cases a chasm between how the story would be reported in a vacuum, absent external pressure, and how it's reported under those pressures. And by external pressures, I mean, and you'd be familiar with all of this, anyone who works in journalism knows this, advertisers threatening to pull their ads, CEOs no longer giving you access to the corner office for an interview because they don't like the article, the editor-in-chief or the publisher not liking a particular angle, so on and so forth, right? And for me, I think every journalist at all times, but especially on this story, because this is where it's most glaring, has to ask themselves, how wide is that chasm between how I would report this story if I wasn't worried about all those external pressures and how I report it under those external pressures? Because that gap, for me, is the definition of journalistic malpractice. And again, it's become very, very difficult to watch Western reporting, the vast majority of Western reporting on Palestine, and not be faced over and over again with that chasm. And if it's going to exist, the least we can do is acknowledge it.
Overall, you're very critical of American liberalism, seeing it as almost a kind of performance, one that doesn't actually stand for or against anything. It seems, if I'm reading you right, that you view American liberalism as something that just needs to be seen as doing something. What do you mean by that?
So the other day I was watching this interview from a few decades ago, I suppose. I think it was in Australia, and it was outside this pool, and I guess from the context the pool was about to be integrated. It was like a whites-only pool, I suppose. And the interviewer was asking people walking in and out, would you let your children swim with indigenous kids? And there was a variety of answers, you know. One woman said, of course, they're just children, which is a really interesting answer to me. Yeah. Because it's supposed to be the sort of non-racist answer, and it's deeply racist, right? This implication that, like, no, they haven't passed the threshold to meet.
Right, they haven't become monsters yet.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then there's someone else saying, no, they need to be separated. And, you know, we've seen examples of that kind of interview in so many contexts throughout history. But what was most interesting to me about it was this idea that there was no question of who the narrative spotlight should be on, right? And it was the white folks, right? There were good ones, and there were ones you may disagree with, and, you know, that sort of thing. But the question of the central narrative spotlight never moved. And so you end up in this kind of, you know, the blindside impulse, this notion of like, yes, I'm a good person, because I'm helping these poor people. And it's very difficult to respond to that and say, look, you respond whatever way you want, whatever individual impulse you may have. is yours to choose, I suppose, but we have institutional issues that we need to address here. And I think most of my frustration with a particularly sort of mainstream definition of Western liberalism, specifically as it exists in this country, is that we are never questioning the narrative spotlight. It's on me and what a good person I am. And that's fine, but it's not addressing any of these structural issues.
So what would shifting the narrative spotlight look like in the context of, say, Israel-Palestine?
I mean, first and foremost, in the most obvious sense, it would require thinking of Palestinians as human, as sufficiently human to be worthy of the basic dignity that we'd afford any human being. I mean, even now, I do events, I go to places where any social function, if the word Palestinian comes up, right? I don't need to tell you this, right? Like, you know it better than most people. And you can't do that. You can't impose that kind of restriction if you think of these human beings as sufficiently human. And so that's the first shift that needs to happen. Because otherwise we are just working backwards from an impression of self. A good person would do this, so I suppose I do this, and now that's taken care of. Well, no, it's not.
Turning back to your book, you said something interesting that I want to draw attention to. You said American liberalism demands rhetorical politeness. You then went on to describe what you called a parade of, quote, stomach-churning Biden press secretaries offering insincere concern for Palestinians while, I think you called it, bankrolling their butcher. Why do you think there's such a blatant contradiction between what the previous administration said, or the values they purportedly stood for, versus what they actually did with regard to Gaza?
It's a difficult question to answer because I think there's some specific elements there related to the Biden administration. I think Joe Biden, if you look at his history in politics, is deeply, deeply antagonistic to Palestinians, that even by the standards of American politics feels... It's a
pretty low bar, too.
Which is a pretty low bar. So I think that there's an element of that there. But I think the other part of it is that there is a performance that needs to be maintained because, again, it's become part of the sort of rhetorical sales pitch of this party. I live in Portland, right? And I often talk about how in Portland you can walk around certain neighborhoods and every lawn has a Black Lives Matter sign on it. And there's not a black family for like 20 blocks in any direction, right? This is the sort of thing that I think in the short run is very easy to do, but in the long run induces a kind of dejection and a kind of disillusionment that ends up in a situation where you're running against some, one of the worst human beings ever to take office and you still manage to lose to him, right? Because slowly you're bleeding out people for whom the performance is not enough anymore. And even at the best of times that happens, but it especially happens when we're talking about wholesale slaughter and a press secretary basically smirking it away.
Of course, there were people who decided to walk away from the mainstream options. They said, no Democrats for me, no Republicans for me. We're going to go Green Party, Socialist Party, some third party option. And the reason for many of those people's choice was Biden and Harris's stance on Gaza. And since Trump's win, there's been a kind of backlash, a significant backlash against these voters. In some circles, there's an almost vengeful, you got what you deserve type attitude that has emerged. What do you make of those types of responses?
I think, again, it's indicative of the most sort of accurate response that I would expect if someone was working from a position of pure pragmatism and sort of cold calculus of acquiring power. Because, again, I live in Portland. I had that version of that conversation many, many times where it's, yes, this is bad, but, the Republicans would be worse. And one of the things I would try to explain is, look, I get it. I agree with you completely. I think the Republicans are worse on every issue. We have, however, crossed a certain line that no longer allows me to operate in relative terms. And for me, it's a moral line. I can't put a little check mark next to that name or next to that party because of what I've seen. And I don't need you to understand that. I don't need you to come with me. You vote for whoever you want. But for the first time in my life, and maybe this is, again, an indication of my cowardice given what I've lived through, I just can't do it. I can't behave in that way. And what's been interesting on the other side of the election is that you have many of those same people who are trying to pull me over now respond in one of two ways, right? Either, well, you deserve, everything that you're getting now, or kind of almost sort of gloating about it.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's almost an element of glee. And what that tells me is that you were never on my side to begin with, right? And now I know. And so, I'm not 100% sure that if everybody who maintained that position that I did voted for the Democrats instead, that the Democrats would be in power right now. I don't know what the numbers game is. I only know that that person who was pretending to be my ally has now shown themselves for who they really are, and that's useful information for me. I know now.
Last week, Israel's Security Cabinet approved a plan to capture, it's the language that was used, Gaza, with Netanyahu saying the cabinet approved a plan to ramp up operations and forcibly displace millions of Palestinians once again. Assuming the U.S. doesn't intervene, and I think that's a reasonable assumption at this point, given history, what can be done, actually done, to stop Israel?
I mean, the first assumption that you make essentially closes the largest avenue of answer to that question.
Which is why it's such a hard question.
Because everything I come back to is, again, and then this is indicative of the kind of human being I am, and I don't mean this in a positive way, is what can I do, right? And what I can do is try to perhaps influence the currents within the place I live. But like you say, it's such an incredibly uphill climb because you're working from a position where not only is there immense support for Israel, but there's immense support for the idea that Palestinians are deserving of nothing, of nothing. My impression is, in the broadest possible sense, and this applies to a human being living here or anywhere else in the world, is to make this an issue that you're willing to be troublesome about, which goes back to this notion of, the things I failed to do at my kids' fun run, right? Are you willing to speak up about this? Because otherwise we are in a position where the most powerful nation on earth has explicitly now made it clear that this can happen, whereas in any other context we'd be calling it exactly what it is. We'd be calling it a historical scale atrocity.
Wow. I want to delve into your early life a little bit. You were born in Egypt. You spent your early years in Qatar, and you later moved to Canada. Now you live in Portland, as you mentioned. Your life is stretched across many cultures, many continents. And in your book, you discuss that as a child, you had your own ideas about what the West might be like, largely informed by those experiences. But you say when you arrived, you encountered racism, you encountered suspicion in many forms and fashions. Talk to me about that. What was that like? What exactly happened?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that is that you come here and you encounter these things. And honestly, the vast majority of them, I could probably live with. What I needed the West to be when I was growing up on the other side of the planet was not an active space, it was a negative space. What I mean by that is, like growing up in a place like Qatar, one of my formative childhood experiences was holding up magazines to the light to try and see past the black ink because somebody had censored certain paragraphs and certain pictures. And all I needed the West to be was the opposite of that, right? It wasn't so much about what the West is as what it isn't. And so you arrive here, and by and large, there isn't someone censoring the pages of the book. And so you put up with whatever comes with that package because you got the thing that you were after. Mm-hmm. And over time, you start to realize the true cost of that thing you were after. And I think it took me a very long time to get to a place where I understood that there were ways in which I was paying for this that morally, ethically, I couldn't justify anymore. And I think a lot of the book is about that.
Absolutely. Do you feel a sense of belonging here?
I don't really feel a sense of belonging anywhere, to be honest with you. I don't really have a patriotic bone in my body. And I think if I had stayed in Egypt, for example, which is where my blood is from, where my family is from, I think I would have been that person.
Really?
No, this wasn't an active choice on my part. This is purely a function of the kind of life I've had. When you leave the country of your birth at 5 and you move around in such a way, I mean, you pronounce my name correctly, right? I rarely get that. Everywhere I'm Omar El Akkad, but I'm not Omar El Akkad. I'm Omar Muhammad Al Akkad, and it's unpronounceable in English and so on and so forth. When you have to exist in that kind of very uncertain space, it gives you a very different relationship with the idea of the nation state or patriotism or nationalism. There's nowhere I feel home. There are places where I have flashes of my past that I can torque into a version of home. But there's nowhere for me that I feel ownership of.
In your book, you said, quote, rules, conventions, morals, reality itself all exist so long as their existence is convenient to the preservation of power. Otherwise, they, like all else, are expendable. Now, those words seem to me distinctly Machiavellian. What do you mean there?
I mean, they're not intended to be praise of the system by any stretch. I remember about a little more than a decade ago, I was in Egypt. I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring, and I was watching this press conference, right? And it was a press conference with this general from the military who was declaring that the Egyptian military had discovered a device that cures all diseases. And he's sitting there, he's standing at the podium, and this is as ridiculous as it sounds. The whole thing is as ludicrous. It's like an SNL sketch, right? And what he has is like a repurposed, I think, bomb detector or something, like just a prop, and the whole thing is a farce. But every journalist in the press conference is applauding and the glory of the nation and so on and so forth. And those kinds of moments are always fascinating to me, right? And you see them throughout history. You see them in societies that are having a really hard go of it. Because generally speaking, I think, and this may be an overgeneralization, but in a society that is remotely functional, the office should be more important than the office holder, right? The office of the presidency should be more important than the president.
Right.
The various constitutions or founding documents are more important than whoever is interpreting or enforcing them at any given moment. And when you've grown up in the kind of societies where that has been inverted, every billboard in Egypt when I was growing up, every political billboard was congratulating the president on winning the election, and these things started to go up months before the election happened, right? And so again, it's an inversion of how things should work. And that's why currently under this administration, my reference point for American politics is the kind of societies I grew up in, because you're watching that inversion in real time.
There's been an ongoing debate about the effectiveness of multilateral institutions in responding to Gaza. We've seen South Africa's case, obviously, brought to the International Court of Justice. We've seen arrest warrants put out by the ICC, the International Criminal Court. The thing is, despite all that, we have seen very little real actionable enforcement. Do you still have faith that these kinds of institutions can prevail in bringing about change or accountability?
That's a really good question. I think my answer depends on my personal definition of the word prevail. Because two things have become clear to me, or at least clearer over the last year and a half with respect to exactly the kind of institutions and systems you're talking about. The first is that there is a significant, if not predominant, contingency of state actors and the most powerful human beings on earth who genuinely do believe that these systems, International Court of Justice, whatever, are not for our allies. They're not for us. They're for the prosecution of those people over there.
Right.
And once you see that sort of inverted, there's immense resistance, right? So again, that's a clarifying thing for me. It allows me to understand where we really are here, But the other part of it, and this is arguably the darker part, is that there's also an exchange rate. There's an exchange rate on human life. I know that there is some number of Palestinians that need to be slaughtered or starved to death before these systems become a little less begrudging, before the gears turn a little bit faster. And this happens at every level, not just the sort of state actor, International Court of Justice level, but I was asked to write an op-ed for a newspaper in the summer of last year. I told them, listen, I'm not going to waste your time. You're not going to run this because I'm going to call it a genocide. And they said, yeah, you're right.
Wow.
And then in January, the same paper asked me to write. I told them, listen, I don't want to waste your time. I'm going to call it a genocide. They said, go ahead.
Really?
What has changed, right? And the deeply cynical part of me tends to think that enough bodies piled up as to fit some kind of exchange rate where the thing that seems obvious to anyone looking at the issue is now obvious to someone who's deliberately trying not to look at the issue.
Does it give you any perverse optimism to think that, hey, that's progress? I mean, there was a moment where I may have argued that no amount of Palestinian bodies or no amount of Rwandan or Congolese bodies would be enough to warrant a change, that the exchange rate was almost incalculable in that way. And now suddenly there is a limit. We do have a moral border. There's some point where we say enough. I mean, does that give you any hope or optimism?
Look, there's no real doubt in my mind that Palestinians will have their liberation, that every human being living under these systems that are insatiable. I mean, colonialism is many things, but it is inherently insatiable. There is no such thing as enough. There is no ceiling here. And yet I have no doubt that anyone who lives under the punishing end of that system will have their liberation one day. And
why?
The reason...
Well, I got to ask you why. Because nothing you've told me this entire conversation would make me lead to that conclusion.
Hey, look, you're interviewing a guy who writes Stone Cold Bummers. This is the most hopeful book I've written. It's still depressing as hell, so don't get me wrong. But I think for me it comes down to one of the earliest things we spoke about, which is this idea of narrative. I'm obsessed with narrative because I write for a living. That's what I do. And to me, in the short run, fighting against any system of power, any unjust system of power, is exhausting. Right? I saw the folks in Tahrir Square who are getting the hell beaten out of them every day and who are paying for this with their lives in some cases. And the exhaustion is real. But it's a short-term exhaustion. The long-term exhaustion of being on the taking end of colonialism is orders of magnitudes greater. Because no matter how much you're taking, no matter how many resources, no matter how comfortable those resources are making your life, you have to wake up every day and tell yourself a plainly fraudulent story. And every day it chips away at you. It chips at your conscience, it chips at your soul.
Yeah.
In a way that in the long run is far more exhausting than anything that could happen in the short run with respect to being snatched off to a secret prison. That's easy for me to say because I'm not the one being snatched off to a secret prison. But historically, I feel like that trend has continued where you fight for justice and that fight is painstaking and brutal, but the person denying you justice wakes up every day and has to lie to themselves. And that's doing damage to themselves that is incalculable. And that's what gives me hope. And it's a very perverse way to frame it. I get it. And it's also a very long-term way to frame it. But I have to resort to that because otherwise I'm waking up and watching the worst things imaginable.
Absolutely. But I want to ask you a question because you said that you imagine victory in the future. You imagine a liberated Palestinian people in the future. Do you see that liberation happening in our lifetime, or is this more of an abstract thing? Like, what happens in our lifetime?
I come from a long line of malfunctioning hearts. The men in my family don't live that long, so we talk about lifetimes. I'm always cautious. I don't think in those terms personally. And I think that's been a really interesting reaction to the book, is that I think a lot of people read the title and thought two things. They thought that I meant next week, and that when this moment shows up, it'll be a celebratory thing.
Yeah.
And I don't think either of those things, because my historical precedents, and I talked earlier about this idea of thinking in terms of pattern recognition. Everyone who wasn't invested in not knowing knew what segregation was. Right? Knew what apartheid was. And yet there's this buffer period of history where you look up and you think, is it safe in my social circles? Is this the acceptable opinion? And that historically has taken an infuriatingly long time. So there's that. But there's no doubt in my mind it's coming, and when it does, it'll be the opposite of a celebratory event for me. Because how many people didn't need to die in between when we knew and when it was safe to say you knew? So certainly, I have never thought of it as a moment that will come in my lifetime or on those terms. But what the hell do I know? I can't predict what's happening in this country next week, let alone, further down the line.
Well, you have a lot more insight than most of us, which is why this book is so important and such an important intervention into the conversation right now. Omar, thank you so much for joining us on UpFront.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.